It'll require a huge effort. And I think one of the tendencies of the British government is to invest in defence to show its European credentials. And if it fails, then its European credentials will be damaged.
Now, at the Munich Security Conference last weekend, Keir Starmer signalled his willingness to consider a big increase in defence spending earlier than planned in order to meet the threat from Russia. The Prime Minister has already set out an ambition to increase spending, to defence spending that is, to 3% of GDP by the next Parliament, building on his promise to spend 2.5% of GDP on core defence by 2027. Now it's being suggested that the Prime Minister could try to meet that 3% target by the end of the current Parliament, i.e. by 2029. Let's speak to Nicholas Williams, Senior Associate Fellow at the European Leadership Network and a former Senior UK Ministry of Defence and NATO official. Nicholas Williams, welcome to the Times at One. Do you think Keir Starmer is entirely serious about this significant ramping up of the rearmament programme?
Yes, I think he is entirely serious, but whether he's capable and the economy is capable of taking such a ramp up of rapid ramp up of defence expenditure is doubtful.
How much would it cost?
The
extra,
current...
if we're to say he's speeding up the commitment to get to 3%, he's going to deliver it by 2029, how much extra would that cost?
Well, the current defence expenditure is about £60 billion, so it would cost 10 to 15 billion if he wanted to do it.
That's a huge chunk. And, obviously any government has to prioritise. I suppose the question for you as an analyst of the government's attitude to defence is whether they're prepared to prioritise it to the point where they have to make sacrifices on the rest of their economic programme. They have to either raise taxes in a way that they hadn't considered, or they have to cut public spending in other key areas.
Yes, and that's why it's doubtful whether this seriousness will be matched by actual rapid increases. I suspect that it will be an increase, but much slower than anyone anticipates.
Keir Starmer was in Munich last weekend, and of course the Germans are clearly very serious about a massive expansion of their defence spending commitments. How urgent do you believe it is that the UK and other Europeans match the Germans, particularly in light of what Keir Starmer continues to characterise as an extremely serious threat from Moscow?
Well, it depends on how much the British government under Starmer wants to play a role, a significant role. Starmer says a leadership role in European defence. If that's the case, if he wants to play a leading role, then he'll have to come up with the expenditure and improve particularly the army's capability to provide what NATO requests, two reserve divisions, which is unachievable in the current size, with the current size of the British Army.
Do you think there also has to be a reconsideration of how the money is spent? It's one thing getting the extra money, it's another thing then deciding how it should be spent. For example, does there have to be a pivot towards a much greater investment in drone warfare capabilities? And does there have to be a new focus on procuring equipment, military hardware, which is coming from Europe, compatible with the Europeans, and maybe a much reduced reliance on hardware bought in the United States?
Well, that's the way the Europeans are going, and I think the dilemma for Keir Starmer is, does he want to invest more in what he calls NATO first? That's what the Strategic Defence Review posited last year. Does he want to go increasingly towards NATO plans, or does he want to adjust and by more Europeans. I mean, the equipment, but the UK defence equipment programme does include major projects with Germany, major projects with France, major projects with Italy. But the overall structure or a purpose of a European defence, is it within NATO or outside NATO? And this is what the Europeans have failed to answer. And so without...
Well, do we have an answer in Whitehall? I mean, are we clear about where we go in terms of prioritising working with our European allies, or insisting still that we are, tied to the Americans and that the Americans will still be committed to a defence of Europe?
Yes, I think the British government is clear. They want to reinforce their NATO first policy, recognizing that a Europeanization of NATO is the way to go. And they also want to prevent the France in particular from straying from that NATO line.
And just pick up, if you would, we're short of time now, but just pick up on my point about the way we spend the money and the kinds of war we think we're going to be fighting in the future. Briefly, do you think the British, you've talked primarily about the army as opposed to the other services, but do you think we get how much warfare has changed, thinking particularly of what we see in Ukraine? Are we able to pivot to spend the money wisely?
Well, that is a key question, and no one knows the answer. Yes, the Ministry of Defence has a programme to examine the lessons, to learn the lessons of the Ukraine war and beyond. The problem is there are Death Star so-called equipment programs which will absorb investment for years and years and years to come. So the pivot you're talking about, it may be desired, but it's not actually feasible in the short term.
And finally, if you cut through the rhetoric to get to reality, do you think the UK will be spending 3% of GDP on defence by 2029?
3%, yes, that may be possible, but it will require a huge effort. And I think one of the tendencies of the British government is to invest in defence to show its European credentials. And if it fails, then its European credentials will be damaged.
All right. Well, Nicholas Williams, Senior Associate Fellow of the European Leadership Network and a former UK MOD and NATO official, thank you very much for joining us on The Times at 1.